Welcome to episode 3 of The Show Me. This episode serves as a companion piece to episode 2, and we strongly recommend that if you haven't listened to that episode yet, that you do so now and save this episode for afterwards. Doing so will provide you with an understanding of the orphan trains and their history in Missouri. As for this episode, I sat down with Shirley Andrews and her daughter Beth to discuss the life of Shirley's mother, Irma Craig, an orphan train rider who arrived in Missouri in 1901. Shirley was gracious enough to welcome us into her home and share her family's history, and for that, we cannot express our gratitude enough. So thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Beth, and let's let them tell us about Irma Craig and how she became part of The Show Me.
I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri. Show me. Show me. I am from Missouri. Show me.
I'm from Missouri.
Show me. Show me.
You're listening to the Show Me podcast with your host, Chris Cowan.
I'm from Missouri.
Show me. Show me. Show me. I am from Missouri. Show me.
I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri. You have got to show me.
And your mother was placed with the New York Foundling Hospital when she was just a couple of months old.
Yes.
Was it common for orphan train riders, especially those of such a young age, to find out who their biological parents were?
Some of them did. I was told I was very fortunate to be able to find out who mine were.
How was your mother able to find out who her parents were?
She was told, she contacted the New York Foundling, and they didn't have her birth certificate, but they told her the New York Vital Statistics Agency that could give it to her. So she and I wrote to them and asked them for the birth certificate. Well, this birth certificate they furnished didn't have a first name on it, but it said that she was born at Sloan Maternity Hospital, and the maternity hospital had only one female baby by the last name of Craig that was born within the month that my mother was born. So they said that that was her birth certificate, and it had her mother and father's name on there, and their ages, and they were both U.S. citizens. They were not immigrants.
And it was in 1898 that she was placed there?
Yes. She was born June 25th, 1898, and she was placed there September 5th, 1898.
With the U.S. economy being in a depression between 1893 and 1898, I think that had a large factor in her being placed for adoption.
That I don't know. I will tell you that she lived in an upper middle class part of it was up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. But in later research, just in the last maybe 5 years, we found out a little bit more about her family. And her father was not in the home. 2 years after she was born, he was not in the home anymore. She was already in the orphanage. She found out that her grandfather and grandmother lived with her mother in that big brownstone building, and the father was handicapped. The census form just says bedridden, handicapped, crippled. You didn't know which, but he was one of those. And he did die the year after my mother was born.
Okay.
And there was the grandmother lived there also. And there was another child besides my mother, a little girl. And she died the year after my mother was born of meningitis. And since her father was not in the home anymore, and the mother was a seamstress and was supporting the father and her father and mother and her other little girl, little Ruby. And when she had this other baby, when the father evidently had come home for a visit, and she had this other baby, she gave it away. She wasn't able to care for all of them.
And in the research that I have done, the New York Foundling Hospital, they differed from the Children's Aid Society, in that the children who rode the orphan trains from the New York Foundling Hospital were placed through the church structure.
Yes.
Yeah. So your mother's biological parents were more than likely Catholic?
Probably not.
Oh, probably not. All right.
I think it was a good place for orphans to be.
Yeah.
And were treated well. The father, we don't know what his religion was, but the mother was Jewish.
Oh, okay.
At least her name was Jewish. We don't have any records or way of knowing that she was a practicing Jewish lady, but her parents were Jewish. Their name was Steinberg, and we've done some research through DNA and such, and they were Jewish people.
Okay.
And they placed her in the New York Foundling. The Foundling Hospital would take children of any race, color, creed, or ethnic background. But the day after they came, they were baptized Catholic.
And one thing that I noticed, that the difference between the two organizations there is that with the Children's Aid Society, they put the children on a train and just go pretty much depot to depot and pretty much just have the people fill out the adoption forms that day and then either approve or reject them. Whereas with the New York Foundling, they use their church networks to find homes for the kids before placing them on the train.
My mother got off the train down in Osage City, Missouri, with another group of other orphans that came down there. And that had been done through the parish priest down there. His name was Father Schmidt, sorry. I'm getting her teacher mixed up with it. And he had probably got up in front of the pulpit on a Sunday and said, we have an opportunity to help some orphans, homeless orphans from New York City. And if you fill out an application with me, I will send it to the sisters there, and they will send you a child. They were able to actually say what kind of a child they wanted. If they wanted a little blue-eyed, blonde child, maybe to take the place of a child they had lost, they could apply for that, or they could apply for a little black-haired, brown-eyed little boy. Maybe they only had girls. Maybe they needed a boy to help on the farm.
Yeah.
The Foundling dealt mostly with little children. They tried to keep them until they were about 3, and then they placed them out. My mother was not quite 3, just a couple months less than 3 when she was placed out.
And she came to Osage City in 1901?
Yes.
There are at least 31 other orphans who rode the train with your mother.
Yes.
I remember reading in my research that she had number 32 on her clothing there.
Yes,
were all those children brought to mid-Missouri, or was it a series of stops? Or
we know, my mother said that at least 21 that she knew of were in this area. But when the train came through St. Louis, there were about 45 children on it. So they placed some before they got here. And this was not the only train that came, of course. There were trains that came like twice a year. And some of them went to Loose Creek and Freeburg and Keltstown and Lynn. And they went on to California, Missouri, and Stover. These children were placed all around. People would go to the railroad station and pick up their child if they had. Now, if they came from the Children's Aid Society, they didn't have to have prior authorization.
Yeah.
And when they came, they had to sign an indenture form saying that they would raise the child, give it a home, feed, clothe it, educate it according to the manner of the area they were placing. Like if your area, most children just went to the 4th grade, that's all you were required to do. If everybody went to high school, that's what you were required to do. And then you had to say that you would raise those children. Those from the foundling, you also had to say you would raise it Catholic. The other ones said from Children's Aid that you would give it a religious background.
Yeah, that was one thing I noticed between the two organizations there. And
Right.
one of the things that really helped the foundling get started was that with the Children's Aid Society, they didn't really care what denomination it was. If you were a Christian, they're putting you there. So a Lutheran could end up with a Catholic, or a Catholic end up with a Lutheran. And
Right.
a lot of people were upset about that.
Right.
See, when your mother was first taken in by her first family, there were other foster boys who lived in that home?
Yes, There were 2 older boys. One was 10 and one was 15, and she was 3. And she always said she had no warm sisterly feelings toward them. They were not always kind to her. And the parents were very good to her. And as the 2 boys grew up, they became bad alcoholics, and then there were real problems in the home.
After she had moved out of that home and into yours, did she keep any contact with those 2 boys? Or
Not with the 2 boys, but with the father she did. The mother had died when Mom was 9 or 10, and of pneumonia, I think it was. And but she was always close to her first foster father. And in fact, when he was in his 80s, he came and lived with us.
Huh.
I don't remember it, of course. I was a baby, but
Yeah.
they were always close.
It's pretty neat. See, another thing that really stood out to me while I was researching your mom's story is that in a lot of communities, the children who came in on the orphan trains, they were ostracized by the other children. They were considered outsiders. They were often picked on and bullied. But with your mother going to school there in Taos, there were a lot of other orphan train riders, and they had that experience there to bond with each other.
Right. Another thing unusual about the Taos area was that most of those children in Taos kept their original names, if they knew what their original name was. My mother's birth name was Irma Craig, and she went by that name all the time, and most of her friends went by their birth name. Now you get around to the other little towns around, many of them went by their foster families' names, especially if they didn't have a good memory of their birth family. I mean, if it had been an unhappy experience, they would be glad to take another name.
And did that seem to be pretty common throughout her schooling, or after was it St. Francis down there?
St. Francis Xavier.
Yeah, St. Francis Xavier. Did that change when she went to the public schools, or did that
No.
seem to be consistent?
No. Just the people down there were very accepting. She said she never felt looked down on or anything. Where many of the orphans, in my meetings and reunions I've been to, many of them were really, their children they went to school with, they were told not to have anything to do with that child. She's an orphan. And they had a feeling that the orphans maybe had bad blood. That was a term they used to use. They had bad blood, Yeah. But Mom said we never felt any different than anybody else.
Yeah, I think she got real lucky with where she was placed.
Yes.
Then after her schooling, your mother had decided to pursue teaching?
Yes. She only went to the 8th grade. They lived out in the country, and her foster mother, that was the second foster mother, she just lived on her butter and eggs money, on the farm. And she couldn't afford to send her to Jeff City. She would have to pay room and board to somebody if she came to Jeff City to high school. So my mom stayed out of school for a couple of years, and then she and a friend of hers decided they wanted to be school teachers. So they went and talked to the county superintendent of schools, and he told them to go back to the 8th grade for a refresher course. And then they could go up to Warrensburg Normal School, we called it, and learn to be teachers. So that's what they did. They went back to the 8th grade. And that teacher, that was Mr. Schultz, and he had a large group of children in a one-room school, but he actually gave them algebra courses and such on the side, so because he knew they wanted to become a teacher. And then after they did that, then they went to Warrensburg for a 6-week summer course and came back here and took the state teacher's exam, and then they were teachers.
Growing up, did your mother ever hide her experiences about being on the orphan trains, or was she always open about it? Or
Yes, she was. We kids, when we were little, many times we would ask, if we'd get bored with what we were doing or something. I can still remember going into the kitchen and Mom would be cooking or baking or something. Mom, tell us stories about you when you were little in the olden days. And she'd always kind of smile. And then she'd tell us little stories about her growing up when she was little and different things that they did. She always had a lot of friends. She was outgoing. She was a very, I call her very gentle, very ladylike, but a very strong person. And she learned to drive a car when she was 18. That was in 1916. One of the very few women in the area that drove a car.
This actually might be a question for you also. But
Okay.
Now, did either your mother or your mother ever threaten to put you on a train? Just asking because I'm a father myself.
No. No. I always told my girls, I said, you may get in get in real trouble with us, but you're always welcome to come back home. Always welcome. Didn't I, Beth? Mm-hmm. I said, you may get a good fussing, but you're always welcome to come back home.
See, your father had passed away in 1939?
Yes.
And your mother had turned down receiving welfare as a widow?
Yes,
And now, was this out of pride, or did she find any irony in the situation that welfare was one of the social programs enacted that helped to put an end to the orphan trains, or?
I think it was more a matter of pride. She felt like we really probably should have had help, but no. She said we're not that bad off.
Yeah, I remembered seeing a comment in an interview where it said something. You were poor, but according to Dwight D. Eisenhower, you weren't that poor. Or...
Right. We were poor, but we didn't know it.
Yeah. And in my research, I've seen that you had served as on the board of directors for the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could tell me a little about that.
Well, the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America is no longer in existence. They merged with an organization out in Kansas, National Orphan Train Complex. And I was on the board of the Orphan Train Heritage Society. It was based down in Springdale, Arkansas. And actually, through them is how I found out a lot about the orphan trains. My mother probably thought there was just one orphan train that came through, She didn't, she passed away before we found out a lot of this. And, but a friend of mine saw an article in the paper about this new organization down in Springdale, Arkansas, and I wrote down there, and they invited us to go down there. And my sister, Mitzi Lensenbard, and I and our husbands went down there and met the lady that started it, and we got active in it, started going to the reunions, and eventually, for some reason, I was asked to be on the board. And I ended up being vice president of it for several years. They wanted me to be the president. I said, nope, I'm not being the president. I'll be the vice president.
And then you had said that you had also hosted reunions for the Orphan Train Riders?
Yes. my husband and I hosted it, Missouri reunions for 5 years. I think the last one was in 2001, I believe, 2001. And the first one we had down at the Knights of Columbus Hall in Taos. And we took a tour of the church museum. And of course, that was nice because there were a number of orphans had gone down there. And of course, there were a lot of descendants that came. And then after that, we always had a little reception at our house before that. You remember that, Beth? We'd always
the reenactment. Carson, my youngest is 18, and we did a reenactment, and he was the baby.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, he was born in 2000, so 2001 would be about right, because in the pictures, he's able to hold himself up. And
we reenacted the coming of the orphans, and
we were very tickled, the grandchildren, because my aunts and uncles dressed up as nuns and as priests, and that was comical to us. And we dressed up as the parents to be, and the adopted parents and stuff. Yeah,
and I played the part of Mrs. Swalen or whatever. We never could. She was a caseworker that came and checked on the children every 6 months or every year, and we never could really read her name. It was her signature,
Yeah.
So we called it Swalen. I played that part, and that was. And we never had a huge turnout. Maybe 70 people from all around the state, would come.
And you'd have those reenactment, and several of them you had over at what park?
We had one of them at a motel, Best Western, and one of them we had that reenactment was for our family reunion out at McClung Park.
McClung, that's we had several of them out there because I thought it would help you with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when your mother had gone to her second family, did she have any siblings there? Or?
She had an older sister who was 18, and Mom was 10. And her name was Mary. And Mary was actually the reason why Mom went over there to that family after Mrs. Bame was her first foster mother, after she passed away. And I guess the neighbors could see that things were bad at the home with these two older boys that were alcoholics. Papa George had let it be known in the neighborhood, maybe through the parish priest, that he would let Irma go to a different home where there was a woman to raise her. And so the one that she ended up going to, Mary, this 18-year-old girl, had always been nice to Mom, and she'd, like at the parish picnics or functions, she would buy her ice cream or gave her ribbons for her hair, different things. And so when they asked Mom where she wanted to go where Mary was. And Mary had been an only child, and so Mom got all of Mary's old toys to play with, which wasn't that much, but there was a little set of dishes and little doll dishes, they called them. The cups were just about as big as bigger than a thimble, they were tiny dishes. And
but it was more than anything she'd ever had.
Right.
That was.
And
cool.
Mary had a little parasol. It was white with blue
Mary
polka
thought the
dots.
sun rose and set on Grandma, and Grandma
Yes.
thought the same of her, and her stepmother
And a
as well.
stepmother, mother was very close. And there was an uncle, unmarried uncle that lived. It was actually his farm, and he too. His name was John Rackers, and they were a happy family. Mom said she was always petted and pampered in that home. She had a room of her own, but she never had that before.
And how do you think that your mother would feel about how the orphan trains would evolve into the foster care system that we use today?
I think she probably would have thought it was okay as long as the children were well taken care of. Actually, my mother was probably in a foster home sponsored through the orphanage in New York. They started that when a woman brought her child there and to the New York Foundling and wanted to stay there herself. And they said, no, we don't have any facilities for grown-ups to stay, you know, and you can't stay. So she left. She came back later in the day and she said, asked again if she could stay. And they said no. And then she came back that evening and she said, if you don't let me stay, I'm going to do away with myself because my family won't take me back. So that gave them she said, if you let me stay, I'll breastfeed my baby and one other. So that gave them an idea of how to take care of these other children, because they were trying to, they called it hand feeding, bottle feeding these babies. And mortality rate was real high in these orphanages. I think they said that in a study that the newspaper in New York did, they bragged about the New York Foundling only had a mortality rate of 45%. Only 45%. And so, anyway, so that gave them an idea, the sisters an idea, and they started a program where a poor mother could come to the orphanage and take a baby home with them in their home, and they would have to be a new mother so they could breastfeed the baby. They'd keep the baby till they were almost 3, and once a month they'd have to come back and have the baby checked by the sisters, and then they would be paid $10 every month. They'd do that. They'd be paid $10. If the baby got sick, they had to bring it to the sisters to be doctored. And that's one of the very first foster programs that was in this, I don't know what they called it, foster at that time, but they did it for the poor people and these babies. And we've always thought, and the mothers, right? And we've always thought, we didn't always know that. Mom never knew that. But once I read that and we got to thinking about it, Mom was such a gentle, loving person. She was well taken care of. Yeah, that's what we've always thought, that whoever took care of her when she was real little was a kind, loving person. Sorry.
Oh, it's all right. It's all right. Was there anything else about your mother that you'd like to discuss? Or?
Well, she was very, like I said, very strong. Dad died when I was a baby, and I was the youngest of 8. My oldest brother was 15, and there were 8 of us. We lived on a Missouri River bottom farm that flooded every other year, sometimes every year. And so she had a hard life. But she was
no electricity, no running water.
No electricity, no running water. She was a very faith-filled person, and very strong, and yet very gentle and loving.
And rather a character.
Yeah.
Very soft-spoken, had a good sense of humor. Had a wonderful, soft laugh that if she got tickled like the rest of us. And
but if you talked about the hard times that we had, I remember her saying several times, I don't remember that it was so hard. And I thought, Mom, you just don't remember. But
she had 52 grandchildren.
52 grandchildren, yeah.
That little orphan.
She said that was another thing she said. She said, I didn't have a family then, but now I've got a family. And she said, there's nothing I like better than getting together with the family.
And she was adopted more than twice, I always felt like, because Grandpa's family loved her dearly.
Yes.
that when she married into the Sneeders family, she was a part of it, whether she liked it or not. That she was, her dearest friends were her sister-in-laws and his brothers, and when he died, they were crushed, and they helped the family out a lot. They
helped move us out during the floods.
Yeah.
And then when we'd move out during the floods, we went back and stayed down with Mary and John on the farm. We went, Adeline, her foster mother, had passed away by that time. She passed away after Mom was married, maybe 4 years or something, 5 years. And but we would go down and stay with Mary and John and them. And then John passed away. But Mary, we've talked about that so often, my sisters and I. You know, there'd be 5 or 6 of us kids who moved in down there on her. She had no electricity or running water. She was living down there.
Had no children,
never married, never had any children. She never gave us any inkling that she wasn't happy to see us and happy that we moved in. And we'd go down there and stay with her, you know, for 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it took, till we could go back to our farm. And when they'd go back to the farm, I was the youngest, so I don't remember I didn't ever have to help. But the older ones had to help. Can you imagine cleaning up a house after it's been flooded by the muddy Missouri River? That all had to be done every time.
Right down there next to the river at Coal Junction Bottoms, where the foundation stood for many years.
Yeah, I remember seeing in one of the articles there about your mother about the floods and all the scent of Lysol.
Yes, that's what. Yeah, when we moved back in, I remember the smell of Lysol. Yeah. So, anyway.
Well, that was really all that I had. So. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about it.
Yeah, well, enjoyed talking to you, Chris. Enjoyed meeting you, Chris.
She passed away in '89, and we still miss her.
Mm-hmm.
The walking into her house, her little house, always to me smelled like a combination of fried chicken and her wonderful pork chops that she fried.
Yeah.
And
or her apple pie.
Or some sort of pie. And I remember making cooking cookies in her kitchen, and New Year's cakes at Christmas, and sitting around her kitchen table, or that little glider love seat that she had in her living room. And at times, all of us grandkids would be in this little 1,900 square foot house. Well, we couldn't all be in it. We'd be in the basement, unfinished basement, or in the yard. But her neighborhood knew when the family was in because there were so many kids there. And she never stressed about it. She was overjoyed to see us, and she loved to garden her flowers, and it was always fun to have her around. She'd go on vacations with us, you know, in an unair-conditioned station wagon with 4 little girls. And we were not the only family that took her on vacation. So she was a trooper. She
loved to travel.
Yeah, and she enjoyed doing it with us, and she was just...
She never lived to go to any of the Orphan Train reunions. She was, when they first started having them up in Trenton, Missouri, Evelyn Trickle was one that started having the Missouri reunions. And she invited Mom, but Mom's health was already getting bad. And she was 89 years old, you know, too.
Yeah.
But she was a very intelligent person, too. She
her typewriter. She used the old mechanical, what you think of, you know, in the 20s or whatever, and she typed a lot of her own memoirs.
Yes. And if she just find an interesting article in a magazine, she'd type it. She just liked to type
something about it, or she'd write notes and margins, you know, that type of thing. And her cookbook always had all sorts of recipes written around. Well, add this; it'll make it better, basically. but she was a sweet, wonderful woman. And
She went to work later in life for the state. She worked at Employment Security, and she loved that. Loved it. You know, it was a whole new life for her. She got out of the house
a lot of good new friends out of that.
Yes.
Too. And she loved her quilting circle at St. Joe.
And she loved to play cards, and later in life she became like a liberated woman. She got out of the house, you know.
You'd see her driving down the road, and she was so little, you'd just see this little head, you know, looking between the steering wheel and dashboard, you know. But she was independent woman.
Mm-hmm. Forced to be, but she
didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
She was always that
but
forced to be independent.
She was very resilient. I know you're not recording this anymore, but
well, I haven't hit stop yet. So.
He can edit all that.
Yeah. She was, what I say about Mom is she was so resilient.
Well, that's really all I had for you. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to talk to me.
We worn your ears out.
Oh, no. I almost feel like I'm part of the family now.
Well, next reunion, we'll invite you.
This program is copyright 2019, the Show Me Podcast. No part of this program may be duplicated or reproduced without the written consent of the Show Me Podcast. Music used in this program is Creative Commons Media.
From Missouri.
Show me, show me, show me. I am from Missouri. Show me, show me. I am from Missouri.